Now, we said in our last lecture that when you're factoring, you should always check for a greatest common factor. So if we look at our first example, this quadratic trinomial has a greatest common factor equal to 3. Remember, we want to divide each term by the greatest common factor, and then write this as a product, the greatest common factor multiplying the quotient. You can see inside the brackets, we have a quadratic trinomial. That means we want to look at A, B, and C. We want two numbers that multiply to A times C and add to equal B. Now, if you're not remembering this whole process from the last video, that means you haven't practiced enough. I would suggest you stop what you're doing now, go back, look on the class Moodle page, find some of the worksheets for practicing, or go into the homework assignments in Pearson and do some practicing of factoring there. You need to be comfortable with this before you move ahead. So we said you can list the factors of your product in pairs. We see that 2 and 5, if we subtract, will give us 3. Now our product has to be a negative 10. That means one of these has to be negative. Our sum has to be positive 3. So we know that 2 is going to be negative. So we're going to write that middle term using our numbers. Make sure you remember your x there. We see in the first group that x is common. We see in the second group that 5 is common. So we have x times x minus 2. Oh, this was a plus 5. Plus 5 times x minus 2. X minus 2 is common, times x plus 5. But you need to be careful. All along, you can't forget about that greatest common factor. Notice that 3 doesn't need to be in the brackets. It's not a binomial, so we're good there. Pause your video, factor the next one. When we looked at this trinomial, we saw there was a greatest common factor of 5x. We divided by 5x with each term and wrote that as a product, the greatest common factor times the quotient. We found -2 and -3 were the numbers that gave us a product of 6 and a sum of -5. We used those numbers to split the middle term and factor by grouping. But of course, we remembered we had to keep our greatest common factor here. So there it is in factored form. Again, remember that you can go and practice all of that in Pearson, in your homework assignments, or on the class Moodle page with the worksheets I've posted there. We want to keep factoring quadratic trinomials, but this time we're going to add another variable. So before we do that, I want you to take a minute and multiply this out. Remember that this means x times the second bracket plus 3, oh, I forgot my y, plus 3y times the second bracket. Now we can use the distributive property to open those brackets. Notice that the resulting trinomial works very much like the quadratic trinomials we've been working with all along. If we look at this first term, we can see that it's a product of the first terms here. If we look at our last term, this is a product of the last two terms. Our middle term comes from splitting that 5 into 6 and -1. So we're going to use exactly the same process when we have an x squared and a y squared. We're still going to look for A, B, and C. We're still going to find two numbers that multiply to equal A times C and add to equal B. We're going to use those numbers to split the middle term. But this time, instead of just x, it's going to be xy. We're going to factor by grouping. And so we have x times x minus y minus 4y times x minus y. X minus y is common, times the quotient x minus 4y. I want you to pause your video and try the next one. Remember to look for a greatest common factor. So for question 2, there was a greatest common factor of 5xy. We divided each term by the greatest common factor. And now I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -24 and add to -5. We used -8 and +3 to split the middle term, and then factored by grouping. Here are two more questions. Pause your video, take some time to answer these. Here's the work for each of these questions. They both had greatest common factors. We split the middle term using our sums and product method, and then factored by grouping. Check your calendar for any upcoming test dates. You'll find those in your schedule or your course outline. And make sure you know when all of your video lectures are due and when your quizzes are due, because there are no extensions for marks. You are responsible for getting everything done on time.